We've now had over 10 years of the Modi administration. So has India's employment situation really improved? I am not even attempting to compare it with the previous Congress era. Not because I'm partial to any political party, but it's just that the data has been made non-comparable. The current flagship survey that the government releases on employment, called the Periodic Labour Force Survey or PLFS, starts only from 2017-18 onwards. And because they changed the methodology, technically you can't compare the results with employment surveys done in the past. So the meter down, so to speak, has only happened since the last few years. And in the middle of this, we've also had COVID. The economy first tanked and then rebounded in the next 2 years as lockdowns eased, COVID disappeared, and people and companies again started spending. Which means it's really difficult to figure out after 2020 exactly how much of the growth in the economy was being driven by the exit out of the pandemic and how much was because the economy was inherently stronger. And so the data that comes out now is very important, because if 2022 and 2023 dynamics were polluted by the impact of the pandemic, the 2024 data is likely to be clean of those impacts. Which is why when the government recently released the 2023-24 periodic labor force data, it is very interesting, because not only does it tell us the state of employment from pandemic levels, but we can actually compare this to the pre-pandemic levels in 2018-19 to see if we are indeed better off or worse off. Hello and welcome to The Bond Economist, your one-stop destination for professional advice on the economy. My name is Arudeep Nandi, and today we talk of how the employment situation has changed from the final years of Modi 1.0 through Modi 2.0 and now starting Modi 3.0. As always, if you like what you see, please hit like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support me, the super thanks button is below. First things first, how has the economy grown in the last decade? I would break up the growth cycle in the last 10 years or so in 4 distinct phases, and I'll put it in terms of BJP's own lexicon of Achhe Din. Between FY14 and FY17, India's GDP growth averaged 7 to 8%. Arguably healthy levels of growth, so as Achhe as Din could be if growth were the parameter. Now, one of the major constraints in this period was the balance sheet crisis that the Modi government had inherited from 2 terms of the Congress government, where the banking sector had made reckless loans to the corporate sector and corporates couldn't pay them back. So non-performing assets of banks zoomed up. And once banks were forced to reflect these in their balance sheets, fresh credit froze up. And with banks not ready to lend, with corporates burdened with loans that they couldn't pay back, India's investment cycle slumped. So this was a period when the Modi government had to take control, set up the right institutions, reform the laws and frameworks around bankruptcy resolution that weren't really working earlier, and bring down the non-performing assets or bad loans of the banks. In fact, we have done an episode on this. I'll leave a link in the description. But unfortunately, Achhe Din didn't last forever. From FY17 onwards, India's growth started sliding. And this was the period when demonetization kicked in.
सैलरी की पहली तारीख, बैंक में तो पैसा आ गया है आपकी सैलरी का, लेकिन कैश बैंकों में नहीं पहुंच रहा है, इसीलिए कैश नहीं लोगों को मिल पाना कितनी बड़ी परेशानी का सबब। सतेन चौहान चंडीगढ़ से हमारे साथ हैं। यहाँ पर लोग कितने देर से,
ये डेली का ड्रामा है, 2 दिन से मैं कैश के चक्कर में चक्कर काट रहा हूँ और पैसे नहीं मिल पा रहे।
And within a few months, the government steamrolled GST into the country.
GST has been passed. This is expected to be implemented in 2017.
Which, of course, was a great reform, but being introduced so close to demonetization, which was already a hit to the informal sector, meant that growth was going to get hit even further. This was also a time when India's NBFCs or non-bank financial companies faced a major liquidity crisis, when one of its largest entities, ILNFS, defaulted on its huge loan book.
The Infrastructure Leasing and Financial Services Limited, or ILNFS, is a huge company that funds major infrastructure projects in the country. But it's run out of money and has a debt of over 91,000 crores. It now needs a massive bailout.
Now, whenever such a large entity falls, it causes a domino effect. Banks and other lenders to NBFCs had no idea which NBFC is strong, which is weak, and so funding becomes tight for all NBFCs. Dominoes that toppled at the time include DHFL, include Anil Ambani's Reliance Capital. So it was like a perfect storm for India. Demonetization, GST rollout, and then the NBFC crisis. And so from near 8% levels of GDP growth 3 years back, growth fell to around 4% as of the first 3 quarters of FY20. Why first 3 quarters? So the pandemic lockdown was declared in the last quarter of FY20, towards the end. So the average of the first 3 quarters kind of tells you how weak growth was even before India was hit by the pandemic. And then of course things went from bad to worse. India went into lockdown mode in FY21 and GDP growth crashed to nearly -6%. Now, because the economy had crashed so much, once lockdowns were removed and on the back of a low base, growth rebounded to close to 10% in FY22. And then it kind of yo-yoed between 7 to 8% over the next couple of years. Basically, the numbers were statistically stabilizing after the pandemic shock. By the way, some good things were actually happening in the background during this time under the shadow of the pandemic. Both banks and corporates were getting their act together. They had sharply reduced the debt on their books. The government had increased the infrastructure spend after the pandemic, doubling the outlay from 1.7% of GDP earlier to around 3.4% of GDP. So in the post-pandemic world, yes, India's consumption is primarily still turbocharged by better off households. Yes, our private investment cycle that had slumped has yet to recover materially. But overall, India's growth has been better and more stable than a lot of other countries. So now that you have an idea of how the growth cycle has behaved over the last decade or so, how has the employment situation evolved? The key to understanding India's employment situation is to understand the difference between people who are in the working age population, people who are in the labor force, and the people in the workforce. They may sound similar, but they're actually very different. And the differences matter when it comes to understanding India's employment problem. If you're working, then you're part of the workforce. If you're not working but actively looking for a job, you are counted as unemployed. Workforce plus unemployed together make the labor force of a country. But there's also a third set of people. Those who have quit looking for jobs altogether. Could be family pressures, it could be constraints by your religion or caste. It could very well be that you are so sick and tired of not getting a job that you have given up searching for them altogether. It's the economist version of Vella. So if you want to visualize this as a Venn diagram, you first have the overall population. Within that, a fraction of the population that are in the labor force. And within the labor force, there is a fraction of people who actually have jobs, or the workforce. The region between the black and the red circles are the unemployed. So you can see from this chart, India's problem is not necessarily unemployment, but the section between the pink and the black circles, the underemployed, the people who are out of the labor force altogether. And there's actually good news on this count. India's labor force participation has been steadily rising over the years, which means that the proportion of people who are out of the labor force has actually been reducing. Also, within the labor force, the proportion of people working or the share of the workforce is increasing, meaning that the share of unemployed is actually coming down. You can see this clearly. Labor force proportion has gone up over the years, and so has the share of workforce, which means that the difference between them, or the share of the unemployed, has actually been narrowing. So the unemployment rate has shrunk from around 6% in 2017-18 to around 3% currently. So one, the proportion of people searching for work, or the unemployed, has come down, and two, a lesser proportion of the population is vela or out of the labor force than they were 5 years back. Although, before we get carried away, labor force participation rate of 45% is nothing to feel ecstatic about. It is lower than a lot of countries, and what it still means is that more than half of our population is still not doing any work or even searching for any work. But okay, if the data is saying that more jobs are being created, the next natural question is where? Only around 1/5 of India's workforce is regular or get a proper salary from a company. The remaining are in the informal sector. They are either self-employed, casual workers, or arguably the worst of the lot, helpers in household enterprises. And this is where the problem starts to creep in. Yes, India has managed to create more jobs, but the share of regular workers in the workforce has remained virtually stagnant. You can see the red section of the chart. Before the pandemic, in 2017-19, around 23% of the workforce was in regular salaried jobs. That's actually come down to less than 22% as of 2023-24, which means that the jobs that are getting created are more in the informal sector, where wages and productivity are much lower. And this comes across when you look at the sectoral data too. Consider the sectors that generate formal regular jobs. The obvious candidate, manufacturing. Some 12% of the workforce was engaged in manufacturing before the pandemic. Now that's stagnated to a little over 11%. Let's take another example, high-skilled services. So things like finance, real estate, professional services, education, health, recreation. Come to think of it, the real drivers of India's 7-8% GDP growth. And you can see that before the pandemic struck, this accounted for around 12% of the workforce. Currently, it is stagnating at 10.5%. Yes, it is higher than the levels during the pandemic, but it's still lower than where we were 5 years back. Same is the case even for low-skill services that have the potential of generating regular jobs, say like transport, logistics, hotels, restaurants. You can see that it has improved from pandemic times to 6.3% of the workforce. But that is still lower than the 6.8% level before the pandemic struck. By the way, just to put it out there, these charts, interesting as they are, kind of needed a lot of time and energy to make. Because one, the government doesn't give this data in Excel form. Rather, it's given in PDF format. And those PDF documents run into 500, 600 pages for every year. And also the government doesn't present the data in these intuitive classifications that I've done here, like high-skill services or low-skill services. Instead, the government gives the data all disaggregated. So, say for high-skill sector, one has to individually type out the data in Excel from PDF for financial services, professional services, health, education, etc., all for 1 year. Then open the next year's 500-page PDF, identify the same table, write out those sectoral numbers. And I basically repeated this until I constructed a whole database, which I then analyzed. And the reason I'm saying this is to underline that what you get on this channel is pretty much original research. A lot of it comes from me personally gathering the data and analyzing it for myself and then presenting it to you. And good research takes time, it takes energy, and it could really do with your support. So if you value this kind of research being curated for you, please feel free to contribute to the channel using the super thanks button below or the buy me a coffee link. So what have we established so far? One, that the share of regular jobs are struggling to pick up, be it manufacturing, be it high-skilled services, be it even lower-skilled services. Yes, their share in the workforce is picking up from pandemic times, but the picture is not looking good relative to pre-pandemic levels. And by the way, it is this trend that is probably getting reflected in the news that you keep coming across, where IITs and IIMs are complaining that they're struggling to get companies to recruit on their campuses and are struggling to attract good salary packages. Because after all, financial services, professional services, manufacturing are the usual hotspots to absorb engineers and MBAs. So, if the regular workforce is not growing, but as we showed earlier, the overall workforce size has increased. So where are these extra jobs being created? Construction? I mean, construction generally absorbs a lot of low-skilled casual labor. It is linked to people's real estate demand. It's linked to the government's own infrastructure programs. But even here we find that the share of construction jobs has also come down. Instead, what has actually gone up is the share of the workforce in agriculture. And this is not good news. Because arguably, this is one of the most unproductive parts of the economy. It accounted for around 42% of the workforce before the pandemic struck, and now that has zoomed up to 46%. Mass employment in a sector where in the best of times, agri GDP growth is barely 3 to 4%. Compare that to the overall economy growing at over 7%, essentially means that incomes of a majority of Indian workers are at risk. So one way to look at it is that incomes have grown since 2019. The government's data suggests that average monthly income for the regular salaried workforce, which is the highest among others, is around 21,000 rupees, up from 16,000 rupees in 2019. But remember, it's only around 20% of the workforce. Then comes the biggest section of India's workforce, around 60% of it, the self-employed. Their monthly income has also gone up in the last 5 years. Same is the case for casual laborers. Around 20% of the workforce, they earn a bit less than the self-employed, and obviously much lesser than the regular workforce. By the way, the data for casual workers is actually given in a per day format by the government. Now, I have multiplied it by 30 here to make it comparable to the others. But remember, a casual worker may not get work all 30 or 31 days of a month. So the actual monthly income could very well be lower. But what's really important for most people is not just their level of income, but also how it compares with inflation. Between 2019 and 2024, both regular and self-employed workers have seen their average gross monthly earnings rise by around 5.5% or so. But guess what? Have a look at that red bar at the end. If you take the consumer price index, you will find that it has also gone up by roughly the same amount. So in real terms, which means once you account for inflation, incomes haven't grown much. The only category that has seen higher wage growth compared to inflation is the casual laborers, where incomes have gone up by nearly 8.5%, hence beating the inflation rate. But remember, they are also probably among the least paid in the workforce. I think at some level, the government has also probably privately understood that the employment situation is worrying. And so even their strategy seems to be changing. Earlier, it was focused around reforms on ease of doing business. So simplifying the whole VAT regime where every state had different taxes and converting it into a uniform GST, cutting corporate taxes. And actually, before the index was discontinued, India was rising up the World Bank's ease of doing business index. Of course, the ground reality could have been quite different, but the point is that there was a lot of bureaucratic momentum behind India going up the World Bank index. Then the government came up with the Make in India program, particularly the production-linked incentive or PLI scheme that is supposed to entice new manufacturers to set shop in India by giving them subsidies. And I guess that the hope was that all of this kind of kickstarts the private investment cycle. And that in turn generates employment. Now, if you go through the budget speech this time, there was no mention of Make in India, no mention of the PLI scheme. Instead, there were schemes directly targeting employment, giving direct benefit transfer of 1 month's salary up to 15,000 rupees to freshers in the formal sector, giving incentives to firms to hire people with lesser experience, offering an internship programs with the top 500 companies, providing help with skilling and education loans, quite unlike what the Modi government had offered in the past. And it kind of suggests that at some level, the focus seems to be shifting from waiting for the private sector to do its thing to the government itself trying to troubleshoot the problem. Will it be enough to make a difference, though, is the key question. For more such insights, like, share, and subscribe to The Bond Economist.